the Wine Tech Insiders Podcast, episode 15. These are the books that we love. A little bit of summer content for everybody while the wine tech world is on vacation or getting ready for September. And then, of course, the wine world getting ready for the Christmas season. We have, again, as always, our wine insiders. Jonathan from Bottlebooks.
Hello.
Laurie from Oushinery.
Hi, everyone.
Nick from Wine Owners. And of course, Seb from Troly.
Good morning, boys and girls.
Laurie, why don't we start off? It's summer. I think you have a great suggestion, a great book to start with.
Yeah, so it's a book called Blush by Jamie Brenner. And full disclosure, I'm just halfway through right now. Like, it was released in June this year, and I just got it. I'm listening to it on Audible. And it's really fun because it's about three generations of women who host a book club in the winery that their family own. And it's just mixing both women empowerment and entrepreneurship in a more macho, masculine, winery environment. And it's mixing it's really not for wine people. It's a summer read. It doesn't go, it's not highbrows or anything like that. But to me, coming from the wine industry, it's just this right angle of the romanticism of what is a winery. There's a lot of description, like sunset on the vineyard, like the fog rolling in, and she's like, oh, that's really so much the appeal. Even when I read the reviews about this book, how a lot of women are talking about that on Goodreads in the reviews, oh, I love being transported to the vineyard. It feels magical. So it was just very interesting, but also they could get a bit of a vision of the back end and how it is hard to make the numbers work. Running a winery is very expensive, it's very difficult. So you kind of get a bit of both ways. Obviously, it's, like I said, a summer read. It's highly simplified, but you know what? It's really quite fun to listen when taking a walk by a seawall.
And Seb, how about you? What
about me? What about wine?
Wine, yeah. Do you have any wine books that you love?
Look, I've actually I do read about one book every month, and it's normally more of a business book. I do listen to a number of different YouTube channels, for example, around wine, and what I'm fascinated with, for instance, the way of explaining the way of discovering wine for the common mortals, for everyone else that's not directly in the wine industry. It's to me, I'm far more interested. I kind of understand how to make wine, and I don't really read a lot of fiction. But on the YouTube channels, for instance, that I find absolutely fascinating to see how different channels try and promote different things differently. They all have a specific, customer segment that they're targeting. And I've discovered one very recently, actually, with a South African master of wine, and they basically look at wine. It's two master sommeliers and one guy who's kind of a learning, and they do topics about, okay, how good is cheap wines, and then how expensive can a wine really be, and can we mix wines? And I just find that absolutely fascinating. So I don't really have a wine book, right, specifically speaking, but I do have wine channels that I listen to and podcasts, right? So there's a few podcasts ultimately that are worth listening to.
Sorry, Jonathan, what about you?
So like Seb, I'm not reading tons of books, more watching things, but one book about wine that kind of grabbed my attention was from way back when Bottlebooks was just starting. I was visiting my uncle in Healdsburg, California, and he took me to meet Bill Williamson, who was a Sonoma winemaker there. He is originally from Australia, worked his way up through consulting, and then I believe was maybe head of sales at SAP during the Y2K. Then he cashed out, moved to Sonoma, and set up a winery. And what was, I think, really interesting to see about the book was it just sort of seemed he was very cognizant of when he went into winemaking, he knew that he had to build a brand and he had to build a story. And so quite early on, he partnered with an author and wrote a book that sort of built his epic story. And it's short, it's an easy read, but it does really give you a sense of his personality and his style of wine, and it helps you kind of bond with him even if you haven't really met him. It takes, and he takes what helped me connect a little bit with more was also just how pervasive this story was through his organization. So at that time, he was one of the only tasting rooms in Sonoma or in Healdsburg where you had free tastings. You paid nothing to taste any of his wines. And it wasn't even just that it was free tastings, he would also do pairings with it. And the people who were in his running his tasting room all knew the stories. And so you walk in there and you could just see his brand, it was just a complete, really impressively implemented brand strategy that went from book through to the tasting room, his salespeople, and it just helps, I think, people really connect with him. And that it was, and doing what we do at Bottlebooks, helping people tell their stories and get their wine information out there. It was something that I found really interesting, I still try and go back and visit the tasting room whenever I have the chance to be back in California. So.
Nick, what about you? Do you have something to recommend for?
This one's been around for a while. I think it was published back in the very early noughties, and it's called Wine and War: The French, the Nazis, and the Battle for France's Greatest Treasure. And it's super exciting, and it kind of grips you really, just sort of reading from the back cover. In 1940, France fell to the Nazis, and almost immediately the German army began a campaign of pillaging one of the assets the French hold most dear, their wine. Like others in the French resistance, winemakers mobilized to oppose their occupiers and so on, and put themselves in quite challenging and difficult positions in order to hide and keep their precious harvest away from their occupiers. And it's a great read. So highly recommended from a sort of gripping, quite dramatic historical novel or historical perspective.
Is that a key thing that wine needs a great story?
Yeah, I think it does. I think isn't there a wine merchant in California called First the Wine, Then the Story? And I think that's an absolutely brilliant name. But I think wine comes to life with stories. I think for people who visit wine regions and visit producers, wines almost always taste better after you've met the producer. So yeah, I think stories are absolutely intrinsic to wine and are becoming increasingly important as we move into an e-commerce world. So
should Jonathan, should winemakers be writing books, or what should they be blogging, or?
Well, I think this is 10 or 15 years on from when Bill Williamson wrote his book, but I think it is definitely about living and breathing your brand, and that's how people remember you and associate with the wine. I mean, wine is partly the wine and partly the experience that you associated or that you had with that wine. So creating those experiences, it makes you remember those wines more than even the good wines, but you just didn't have an experience associated with it.
And what about doing fiction, Laurie? I mean, what about just making up stories and having your wine be part of the story?
I think it could be kind of interesting, honestly. Like it's just like making it like accessible, and I think it's all about offering different. I know we were just mentioning the war and everything earlier with Nick, so maybe angle of attack is maybe a bit too strong of a word, but I think there's different approaches to wine, and again, that's why I think we all love this product so much. Like wine is a delicious, liquid to enjoy, but wine is also a social moment with friends and family. Wine it exists, like wine is a moment in time, like memories. Wine is a place, like the terroir and like the winery itself. So I think just if wineries can find different ways to approach and to have that product relatable, I think it's just very interesting. And I see a lot of potential. I think the world of fiction, I'm a bit like all of our panelists here, I typically read nonfiction, but there is something about like the escape of fiction that is particularly enjoyable. That's usually like, again, like a summer things for me. It's it's very just delightful.
And then
wine.
what about for those who don't read books like Seb, who just listen to podcasts and videos? Seb, how do we get those stories? How do you get those stories, out in different ways?
It's what I don't really tend to. What I'm really interested in, what I'm really fascinated with is like what Nick said around the story being increasingly important. I wholeheartedly agree, but I also massively disagree in the way that the story is becoming more important. The story has always been important, and the question is, how do we communicate that story? And we're all trying to reach consumers. We're all trying to push a product that is slightly oversupplied, that is crazy fragmented. There is not a few hundred stories of winemaking around the world. There's probably a few hundreds of thousands of wine stories. And so look, from a YouTube perspective, there's different ways of talking. There's a winery that I follow on YouTube, for instance, and they do like daily vlogs, or every couple of days they do a vlog as to what's happening at a winery. And again, to most people in the industry, this is nothing new. But to the consumer who's never visited a winery, the new up-and-coming Gen Z consumer, it is actually quite fascinating. There's another group in the East Coast, Northeast coast of the US, who's doing wine in a can, for instance, and they're looking at keto-friendly wines and trying to figure out a way of marketing a new kind of a product. And that to me is just fascinating. If you have a look on YouTube, the guy I mentioned earlier on, Wine King, it's look, I don't really listen to those videos on an ongoing and regular basis, but I just find that they've got some ways of presenting that story that's a bit less romantic, fla fla ha ha, that we've all seen the hills before, and it's nice and cute, but unless we're going with friends, it's not the same thing. And so these guys are looking at wine from a different angle, from a consumer angle. And look, they're master of wines, right? They know what they're talking about. So yeah.
So now switching over to the tech side of our podcast, I think what's amazing is that very recently business has kind of changed, and what's happened is the internet came along, the iPhone came along, and it created these digital businesses. And these digital businesses are still businesses, but they have different language and they have different ways of running them, and they've created this kind of startup culture. And now you get books, you get blog posts, you get information that's coming at us that's quite recent and quite relevant. And some of those ideas stick, and some of those ideas fade away, and some are just, not really based on anything. And so I think it'd be very interesting to hear what books have inspired you from the business tech side.
So I love this book called The Tiger That Isn't: Seeing Through a World of Numbers. And the premise is that, people posit numbers as being significant, huge and get people to think about something in a particular way or to do things off the back of a number that's basically bamboozled them. But in context of how that number is presented, it might not actually be a particularly large number. And so the example I gave was for our software as a service platforms that basically process pricing data every week as part of the sort of curated data set that then businesses can leverage for their benefit. We process about 100 million price points a year in partnership with Wine Searcher. And that represents probably around, I don't know, 390,000, 400,000 wine vintages. Sounds like a big number, right? 100 million. I mean, it sounds like a really big number, but actually when you break it down and you think about the number of wine offers that are put up for sale every day, and you look at that over the course of a whole year, it's a real drop in the ocean. So that's why I was excited when I first read that book, which I read at business school, and it does definitely inform how I evaluate things and determine what decisions to make, where to invest, and where to question, I suppose, as well.
And what role does I mean, obviously profit and loss is a big part of every business, but what role do these other numbers you're talking about play in this modern startup world?
Well, I think, in many, many ways. I mean, just evaluating the size of your market, the size, we're in quite a small market. Whereas if you look at, for example, I don't know, Microsoft Dynamics, a kind of a core platform for pretty much any sort of business on earth that you can imagine, their addressable market runs into hundreds of millions of businesses, or at least probably 100 million businesses. Whereas, our addressable market is probably in the region of about 20,000 wine merchants worldwide. So that's probably half the total population, but sort of then kind of breaking it down into that part of the market that's addressable because it's a business that wants to grow. It's a business that's got some ambition. And yet, if you then context that with how frequently those businesses are on a reinvestment cycle, and you look in context of how many businesses are serving a difficult, awkward, different market, which are not that many when push comes to shove, not specialists, then all of a sudden that looks like a very significant market, even though the number on the face of it looks very small compared to some other numbers that people might sort of throw at you.
From a business standpoint, look, a couple of books that I have read, I think 3 or 4 times. One of them is The Hard Things About Hard Things, and one of them is high performing organizations. They are absolutely not wine driven. They are full on large sort of a business building kind of a books. But the first one, The Hard Things About Hard Things, is really interesting because we're basically looking at any kind of a business, anything you're trying to build, anything you're trying to get off the ground, anything you're trying to change or challenge, or there's always going to be so many things getting in the way. And that book really explores the topic left and right, and what founders go through, what's the team going through. So to me, The Hard Things About Hard Things, anyone trying to build, getting something off the ground is an absolute good read. And high performance. Oh, look,
this book is amazing.
Yeah.
And just the
exactly.
art of like making decision, right? Like it's just, and then the hard ones and just like sticking to it and just like, you make me want actually to reread it. Like I think I read it only once, but it's on the 100%. Kindle right here.
Yeah.
And like,
And look, I think it was written by the Ben Horowitz, right? The A16Z guy who's actually worked with a number of different founders. And you'd kind of look at his profile as being a bit of a traditional VC, pumping money to grow artificially kind of a thing. And the book doesn't read that way at all. The book is really sort of a, understanding grit, understanding challenges, understanding that there's always going to be something getting in your way. And high performance organizations is Andy Grove. Andy Grove was the Intel guy. The guy who basically, he worked, I think, most of his life at Intel, but he's behind the Intel Inside campaign in the 90s, for those of you who were born back in the 90s. But the whole idea is that Intel, as an organization, as a really large business, faced a hell of a challenge where making chips was no longer viable. They were making different types of chips and different things and different silicons. And they decided to focus almost exclusively on one kind of a product. And to a certain extent, from a business standpoint, how do you really change and pivot? And this is a 1,000 people, thousands of people organization. How do you pivot? How do you change? How do you communicate? How do you stick with your guns? I just thought, look, these two books, I read the both of them probably on a yearly basis. It's just a really good refresher.
Laurie, is there a book that you're rereading or a book that you love from the tech side or the business side?
More like on the business side, a book that I've read a couple of times already is The Coaching Habit, Say Less, Ask More, and Change the Way You Lead Forever by Michael Burgess-Stanier. I can't pronounce his name properly. Sorry, Michael. And it's just really fascinating because it's all about I think coaching habit, I think the name is misleading. It's not about coaching at all, or more like coaching yourself in asking the right type of question so that you're not leading into the answer that you want to hear. So I think it's very interesting when I work with my team, to ask the question, you have just a series, it's 4 questions really that you have to go through and just seeing what it unlocks for possibilities. And that's also a model that we use for our customer interview. So when, for example, a long-time customer at Oushinery, get on a Zoom call with them and just kind of going through the question. And one of the big haha moments, and it's so simple, I'm going to give it here, is you ask the first question, people will answer, and they will answer genuinely, but they're kind of put on the spot. So and they want to, it's the human nature, they want to please you. So they kind of also answer with something that they probably think you want to hear as well. And then you just follow up with that other question, and what else? And whatever the answer in that what else question is pure gold, because first they had time themselves, their brain in the back, the back burner was thinking about what they really wanted to talk about. You demonstrate that you're here to listen and hear, listen what they have to say. And just we discovered so many gold nuggets that we then implemented on our Oushinery. What are the very pain points, the deeper pain points, things that we can really help wineries with. So the what else question, obviously the book is a few hundred pages, so it's more than that, but I love the simplicity of it and really trying to apply it in everyday life, beyond even business. Highly recommend.
And is that, as a leader, is that the ability to listen, is that something that you had at the start, or is that something that you've been working on, or is that?
I've been working on that. I think really fast. I speak really fast. I eat really fast. Hopefully, I don't drink really fast. It's just and I think it's just not fair to my team to, not understand where I'm coming from. It's also, I'm very aware that I don't have all the answers either. So being able to pull out the best from the people I work with and the people I work for. I think we hear often, right? In the world of startup and entrepreneurship, it's just founder build a product, don't talk to anyone, and then they're surprised that nobody likes it. So that's also, I find, a way to keep me in check with what it is we're trying to solve. And with, again, what I love is how very human it is. Even sometimes with my family, it's just and what else? Just giving this opportunity for people to speak up. It's honestly fascinating. It's yeah.
Jonathan, to you, do you have a book for us?
I have a book that I read earlier in my previous life. I worked for a large international consulting company, and in those days, things really worked like the old waterfall principle or waterfall methodology when you would build things where you were
Jonathan.
Yeah, I know. Where you would lay out a massive plan, do a complete design, and then you're expected to execute a project that was going to take you 9 to 18 months and expect to know all the answers up front. And I was involved in a project that I was quite junior, but I saw this project go quite sideways. And then the program came back together, and for the next phase, one of the clients said, we're going to do it this way. We're going to do agile. And we're like, well, what's agile? And one of the first books that he gave me to read was this book, was The Mythical Man Month. And basically the crux of a Mythical Man Month is that adding people or adding manpower to a late project only makes it later. And that you can't just sort of rush to the finish or just do something magic to get to the finish, and you have to be a bit more agile about it. That kind of put my career on a different trajectory. And then I started becoming a believer in Agile and Scrum, and became an evangelist for this region in my company, and brought it into a couple other organizations after that, because it just made so much more sense that instead of working towards, what they used to call these death marches, where it's like the closer you get to the end of the project, the longer your days, the less weekends you have free, and it's just, you're just marching to the finish, that you do it in smaller increments, and then you end up with a product that actually meets the requirements, because you took a small bite, looked at it, adjusted it, went a little bit further. So you're building it iteratively. And I think nowadays there's not really any company or any tech company who's successful who's not doing it that way.
What about wine companies? And does anybody know any wine companies sort of trying to operate in this way? Producers?
I think we're all trying to get wineries to somehow look at life, a business life, that way, right? Look, the challenge is that traditionally, wine is a much longer kind of a cycle, and there is a artistic, there is a craft, there is a natural kind of an influence onto the product that we probably don't have as much in the world of tech. So the question is, to a certain extent, as a product maker, if you're a winemaker, or if you're a tech person writing code to actually publish a product, what's the balance between having a vision to execute and actually build something that you just need to know that it's going to work or not work, it's your idea, versus the other way around, kind of build something for the crowd. And that's where I think the wine industry could benefit a whole lot of data-driven, let's build something for the crowd, let's try and understand what's the new consumer drinking. But at the same time, the product, holy crap, right? It's not an easy predicament to decide to build a winery. You're going to buy a piece of land, you're going to plant some vines, 5 years later, you're going to get some grapes, and then you're going to build a building on top of it. And then if you're lucky, 5, 6, 7 years later, you have a product to sell. I mean, it's not easy to be agile in that context, right? It's really not that straightforward. But I think it's a balance. I think every business needs a level of a balance. Tech is far more capable of learning really quickly and deploying really quickly. We build a line of code and we deploy it the next week, as opposed to wine, which takes a whole lot longer. So it's much harder, but we need to try and help the balance tilt a little bit for sure.
Yeah, I think the other way that like the wine industry can be agile is also looking outside of wine. And I'll go back to Bill Williamson, because this is kind of what happened to him, is that he had his wine club, it was going along, and then in 1 month he did he was like, oh, let's just throw cheese into the boxes. And then the next time the shipments were going out, people were like, Bill, where's the cheese? And so then he opened up a cheese club on top of his wine club. And then he was doing these doing the pairings in his tasting room. And people eventually wanted to have exactly what he was pairing with in his tasting room. And then he started a spice club and a toppings club, so jars. Exactly what he was serving in the tasting room, he started selling to home. And I don't know if he ever said how much he was making from his non-wine part of the business, but I can't imagine it was an insignificant amount, because you would go in there and you might not be having a bottle of his wine every day, but you might be putting, his spread on your toast for morning breakfast, or on your sandwiches or whatever. And David, you were there with me. It was really effective, and it was based on wine. His core business was wine, but he was able to iterate on these without waiting for the next vintage. He just found a partner and rolled it out, and that was, I think, really, an interesting way of growing a wine. Well,
serving wine with a little bit of food is probably sacrilege for a lot of winemakers, because you're influencing the taste. But for the average consumer, it makes the wine taste better. So so it was really interesting. So it just created he's just there to sell. So I mean, he has one focus. He's there on a slice of the process, and it was very.
And ultimately, look, Laurie mentioned the finances of building a winery, right? And if you happen to have a bucket load of cash and you just want to build a bit of a lifestyle kind of business, make a wine for you and your mates just to get smashed on the weekends, fine, do whatever you want. But if you're not in that predicament, you really need to understand that if the consumer wants to eat something with the wine, I mean, just get over yourself, right? And look, it's fascinating because we have a number of wineries using Troly who also do olive oil, who also do cheese. We also have one doing cheeses, and we also have wine clubs running on a 1, 2, 3 bottles per month, and we have wine clubs running on a 12 bottles a year or 6 bottles a year even. And you can just see how it's not only a different offering and a different way of running your club as a business, but it's also a different offering to consumers, right? Some consumers just want to get a small order on a regular basis. Other consumers want to get food with it. Some consumers are really interested in what you're making as a producer. So if you happen to make olive oil as well, they're going to take it. And I think the way of reaching consumers, the way of crafting a product to offer to consumer is where there's a lot to be said. Let's put it this way.
Well, thank you everybody for listening to episode 15 of the Wine Tech Insiders podcast, the books that we love. I'd like to thank again our insiders, Laurie from Oushinery, Nick from Wine Owners, Seb from Troly, and Jonathan from Bottlebooks. See you on a few weeks.
See you later, guys.
Have a great summer.